Oh, hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am that host of yours, Liv, here with yet another conversation episode. I know I say this all the time, but this is so the coolest part of my job. I mean, all of it is cool, let's be honest, but the fact that I get these super smart and academic nerds coming on the show to share their studies and their passions and their knowledge, the things they're so incredibly knowledgeable on and just want to share with others, I'm just so fucking grateful that not only do you listeners want to hear this stuff, these like heavy and fascinating episodes on these deeply specific topics, but also that I have so many incredible people that want to come on the show. Fuck, it's cool. In fact, it's so cool that I often have so many guests to talk to, so many that I can't even fit them on the show for sometimes even months after I record. Which is what is the case here. So I spoke with David Wright way back in maybe October. Like it was really close to spooky season, but too late to have it actually air during the spookiest of seasons. But this episode was so much fun to record. I mean, as always, but still it was. Because, well, we talked about monsters. Monsters of Greek myth, monster theory as a theory, and so much more. It's one of my more freewheeling conversations because you all just know how much I can go off when we're talking broad mythological topics like this. It's so funny to hear the difference when an academic is sharing something I'm totally unaware of versus something I know a lot about. Like this. What a time. But also, David and I just had loads of fun chatting about this. There's so much to say about these monsters and how they became what they are in the history of Greek myth, but also the idea of this monster theory as a concept. It's all super intriguing. As always, honestly, this is just so much fucking fun, and I'm thrilled to finally share it with you so many months later. I'm doing something similar right now, actually recording a load of episodes, so many that I'll have months and months worth of conversations. It's so fucking fun! But I digress. Again, in today's episode, Dave and I spoke about the best of Greek mythology's monsters, including, obviously, Medusa. Lots of Medusa, because I am me. But also we talked about my beloved Hecaton Kyries and the Gigantomachy, among other things. Specifically, we were looking at this monster theory. Lots of interesting insights to the invention of these monsters, where the ideas came from, and what they can say about the humans who developed them. Also, we just had a great chat about how cool and exciting these creatures often are, because, I mean, Greek mythological monsters are amazing. So sit back and enjoy insights into these fascinating and insightful creatures of myth. Conversations, the many faces of monsters. Monster Theory with David J. Wright. One thing I've learned lately is just the way that the Greeks put snakes into their myths is super interesting.
Oh, and that's kind of like what partially got me into like this research avenue. It's just sort of like snakes can be very negative, like I think, like and I feel like students immediately identify that. Oh yeah, like snakes are bad because of the Bible, But like actually, there are times when snakes are very positive and these sort of like protector figures, and they are much more like polyvalent.
Well, and I really just appreciate the way that they. I mean, and I guess most of these, and now maybe we're just in this episode and I'll use this all, but because I recently did an episode on like Typhus, whatever, and Echidna, and their use of snakes is so fascinating. And like, they are technically kind of villains. Like there is that whole moment where Typhon is definitely a villain, but ultimately they're just sort of like exist to be the parents of other monsters. But
Mhm.
the way they use snakes is fascinating to me. There's so many different versions of Typhon, but all of them are just like so many snakes. And sometimes it's like he has snakes for fingers,
Mhm.
and or like snakes just growing off of his shoulders, and like
Mhm.
this very wild use of it that I'm so curious about. And I
Yeah,
don't
and like
know.
Cerberus has snakes sometimes too,
Yeah,
which is
like a snake
interesting.
mane.
Yeah,
That's super weird when Cerberus is like, he's got a mane and it's snakes.
and it's snakes. Why did it always have to be snakes? I think there's a tradition too that like Pausanias loves to sort of be like, that's all the myth and that's crazy talk or whatever. Like I think there's like I think it's Pausanias that says like actually Cerberus was just a giant snake, and that's it was a snake that guarded the underworld, which like makes sense, right? And like okay, yeah,
I mean, Pausanias, I haven't read a ton of Pausanias, but I've read The Life of Theseus. And no, that's Plutarch. What am I talking about? Either way, they're very similar in that treatment
they
of
they,
like
they like the rational. They both are rationalizers. Yeah,
exactly of
yeah,
something that's like explicitly myth. Like I
yeah.
love the Plutarch's Theseus where it's like, oh, these are the things that I believe, like, but these are the things that I think are fake. And he really tries to piece out like what's real about Theseus versus myth, even though ultimately, I mean, obviously all of Theseus is a myth, but even still, the stuff he decides is realistic is still like absurd. And you're like,
Yeah,
okay, I don't totally know how you're like picking and choosing out of these things, but sure.
yeah, yeah. Plutarch is interesting because I think scholars like him because he's almost like rational, but then sometimes he just believes the most ridiculous things. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
yeah. Pausanias is pretty similar too.
Yeah, I the only thing I'm trying to think of what I've thought of him recently, and I think it might have even have just been I've tried to figure out where the like myth of Minthy comes from, like the nymph who was transformed into mint, because
Mm,
usually it's that she like Hades had an affair with her, so Persephone or maybe Demeter turned her into mint. And I'm pretty sure that there's only like a couple references to her, and I'm pretty sure one of them is Pausanias.
mm,
So it's just like where she became this big myth specifically because she's a foil to Hades and Persephone. So in all the things now that retell their relationship, they always use Minthy as this like this foil or this like person, who's like into Hades and therefore is a problem or what have you. But ultimately, like the myths of her are like Pausanias saying something like, there's this mountain in I think Arcadia or Achaea or something where there's mint, and they say it was a nymph. And then somehow that's become like this epic
yeah,
like myth about a woman who was transformed into mint, and ultimately it's like
yeah.
a way to explain a region or something.
Right. No, that's really interesting. It makes me think too. Like I can't forget his name now, but like of course another example. But like he does all these sort of like I say Hellenistic writer who does like poems about like potions and things like that, and often he sort of
Mm.
like uses like metaphorical names for things. Like I seem to remember him saying, "Oh yeah, and you mix nymphs in," which is like I think he means mint.
Mm.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and in the case of that nymph, I think the whole point is to just explain the use of mint in covering up the smell of decay, like for
Hmm.
the dead. And so, in
Hmm.
order to account for the fact that they used mint, in like death practices, they would then say, like, oh, it's because the mint is
Mm.
associated with the underworld because of this nymph who is transformed into mint.
Right.
So it's just
Yeah.
interesting to track those little ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
But ostensibly, we're here to talk about monster theory.
Monsters, right? We were there for a little bit with Typhon, and then we kind of like yeah, no, but I love that. I love the transition there.
Oh, I know. I mean, I just love talking about mythology, clearly. I
Yeah.
do
Oh,
it
same,
literally all the time, and
same.
I'm still excited about it all the time.
Yeah, same. These. I feel like I've just been studying this for a long time, and I don't get bored with it. Yeah, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
So do you primarily teach myth, or
I'm
do you
kind of all
all
over
the
the
time?
place. Like actually, like it's funny. I
Yeah.
never took one myth class in high
Mm.
school or college or grad school, and then but I kind of like got into myth through like studying Latin and Greek literature. And
Mm.
I remember the first time I had to teach a myth class, I'm like, oh my god, like obviously I know how to do this. I've like written a dissertation on a myth, but I'm like, how do you teach myth? So, but I've been doing it. Actually, this is my second myth class now, but it's definitely one of my favorite classes to teach. I think because you have the myth heads who come in, which are a blessing and a curse, some ways.
Yeah.
But I just think it's so fascinating how you can use myth to talk about so many different topics. You use myth to talk about gender. You can use myth to talk about philosophy. You can use myth to talk about race. You can use myth to talk about trauma. It's just so fascinating. So yeah,
Yeah, that's so true.
love teaching myth.
It's interesting. I bet you teaching it like that is so similar to what I experience with my listeners, except that they're so much more you were so much more accessible to them, because the thing I face most is people getting confused by all the variations, or like,
Hmm.
the things you learn from pop culture versus the truth of the myths, or what actually
Yeah.
exists in the ancient sources.
Yeah, I definitely get that a lot, but it's kind of interesting where like I'll have some students coming in, I think, who like are interested in myth. They're like, oh, but I want to know about the real versions of them. And some of them are already kind of gatekeepy. I sort of think like, yeah, well, like myths do shift over time, and there is no such thing as the true version, of Odysseus. There's actually so many different variants. And it's all about like people in power trying to say, oh, this is the variant that I want, and there's usually like some sort of social political reason why they want that. And then like you come to like the medieval, Renaissance, modern era too, where you have like these myths are constantly changing. But I think it's kind of funny when people get mad, like, "Oh yeah, like this modern person is changing the myth." I'm like, well, it's always been changing, but there are some times when people do change in a problematic way too. Like you take the myth of Persephone and Hades and try and fashion it as a love story, or like, yeah, you can change it, but then you still kind of have to acknowledge that like the origin of this myth is about violence. So it's kind of tricky when I have students come in being like, Hades was actually a great guy who loved his wife. I'm like, ooh, we gotta talk about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. I have huge respect for one adaptation of Hades and Persephone, and that's Lore Olympus,
Hmm.
because I think she's doing it the right way. Like, I think she's completely removed the abduction part and just like taken these two characters and made them different. And she treats Demeter well in a way that a lot of adaptations love to demonize Demeter and make Hades this like super loving guy. And I'm like, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I hate it. Like, I hate it a
Yeah,
lot.
it's kind of like a different form of misogyny of like sort of make Demeter like the overbearing mother.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
bizarre. But yeah, I mean, I face the original myth a lot. Those people coming at me because I like Medusa or something. Usually that's all online and not about my podcast, but I do love the people who love to scream about the original myth of Medusa and how.
yeah. That was
Yeah.
one of them too, and maybe this will factor into our conversation later. But I had students coming to me because I feel like I kind of know some of the Tumblr stuff just from being on Twitter. I
Oh
wish I were
gosh,
on
yeah.
Tumblr, but Tumblr I'm still overwhelmed by. But one of these days, maybe I'll get into it.
Yeah.
Um, but I had students coming saying that Athena transformed Medusa to protect her,
hmm
and I kept like, "Where is this coming from? Is there actually
Tumblr.
an ancient thing?" And it's from Tumblr, you know?
It's from Tumblr, absolutely. I get it all the time.
Yeah,
And like I like the idea behind it. I mean, it
yeah,
all relies on Ovid's version
right,
entirely, right? Which like fine, I like Ovid's version.
yeah.
Um but at the same time, like I mean, I like the idea behind it, this idea that Athena was actually being like a good woman, but it's
We want
not
we want
it's
so
not.
hard to make her the good woman. We really want Athena not to be some sort of patriarch, some upholder of the patriarchy.
That's the
Um,
thing, but it's like even if she did to protect her, she's still upholding the patriarchy, because
yeah,
that should not be a form of protection. Like that,
right,
that's dark.
yeah,
Yeah, I have people bringing that to me a lot, and I try to
yeah,
like very kindly point out the issues with it, and I know it's well intentioned, but also it's like I don't know, Medusa's so interesting without having to invent
right,
Tumblr memes about her
yeah.
that like change things.
And there are good and better, adaptations of modern feminist adaptations of the Medusa myth too.
Well, exactly. And the thing about it, I mean, and obviously I can go on about Medusa forever. She's kind of my thing. But even if you go back to like Hesiod, he's not saying that she's some evil monster at all. He doesn't even remotely imply that. And then, basically Hesiod has what I take as Medusa, and I don't love Hesiod because he did not love women.
He did not.
I don't know
No,
if you've
this
heard.
is this is true.
No.
Yeah.
Um
My students are like, "Wow, it's super misogynistic." I'm like, "Yep."
That's welcome to Hesiod. Oh my god, Pandora in Works and Days. It will always blow my mind. Like
Yeah.
the way he goes off. Anyway, but yeah, no, I mean even that version of Medusa, like by a source that is notably misogynist, is still kind to her. It's literally like
Yeah.
she was a Gorgon, doesn't define what that is. She had a bad fate. Like it's actually kind to her. So it's
Yeah.
just fascinating to me, the whole Medusa
No, you're
thing.
absolutely
But
right. Yeah.
So, speaking of monsters, I don't know anything about monster theory. What is it? I mean, I could clearly keep talking about myth generally too, but yeah, what is the theory behind it? I will read the thing that you sent me as well, but I'm glad to just have you talking to me because that's easier.
Sure, yeah, and I kind of give a brief overview of it, like when
Yeah.
whenever I give like my talk on it. It's kind of funny because I wrote a dissertation that I'm turning into a book on the giants in Greek and Roman mythology, and it's funny like
Mm.
classicists are kind of historically have been very averse to theory, like oh theory, ooh, like but it's kind of awful. That's why our discipline is so stuck in the past for so many reasons. But yeah, aversion to theory is one of them, and I kind of wanted to be like not like the other classicists, and I'm like, oh, I'm writing a dissertation on monsters. I should really I heard this thing called monster theory. I should check it out. And actually, it didn't really incorporate into my disc, but I think it's gonna, I just it will work its way into my whatever I turn my dissertation into.
Mhm.
Um, but basically, it's the idea that like monsters are some sort of like a reflection of some sort of cultural anxiety or even desire or fantasy. Mainly, this seems to be more the anxiety portion of it. Like if you think of the Latin word monstrum, it's related to the word monstrare to show, or the
Mm.
verb monere to warn. So something about like advising and warning with them. It's the idea that they're like so basically he has these different theses. Like the first thesis is that the monster's a cultural body. Second thesis is that the monster always escapes. Think about like in movies, right? How there's always a sequel, the monster always comes back, and like you can bring that to like mythology where you have like because I'm interested in the giants, but the giants is a different iteration of the titans. Are the titans monsters? I mean, they can't really kind of see what they are, but they're kind of like part of that system of opposition to Zeus's order. But then Typhon is also part of that too. So all these different iterations of like
Mhm.
these monsters kind of keep coming back. This idea that these cultural fears kind of keep coming back. Sometimes they sort of shift.
Mhm.
Um, so it's the idea that like the monsters can sort of reflect something about society. So we have like so many female monsters, right? And you sort of see, okay, like what is the society saying? And when you make a woman, have snake for hair and she can turn you to stone, like what's that say
Hmm.
about that society? So yeah, there's always a
Yeah.
different sort of idea that like the monster is other. It sort of often reflects some sort of marginalized uh, group in society. So you see like, sort of the female monster with, say, the sirens or with Medusa. But then obviously you have male monsters too. The Cyclops, you can kind of see him as like he's the uncivilized, in scare quotes,
Mhm.
foreign other who doesn't really like follow the rules of society. Actually, there's a great article coming out by Jackie Murray that she argues there's a whole race system going on in the Odyssey, where like basically um, the Cyclops, what is he? He's a shepherd, and what
Mhm.
does Odysseus, like, what Odysseus' slaves back home? What are they? Shepherds. You have Eumaeus,
Hmm.
the shepherd, and so you kind of see that like Odysseus telling the story of the Cyclops. Like, oh, he's a scary shepherd who's gonna come and eat us all, and this is why we enslave these people, back home. So sort of like you
Mhm.
kind of see just how the Cyclops is sort of this emanation or this sort of representation of like the fear of the people they enslave back home.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, I was talking to Joel Christensen the other day, for the show too, and talking about that kind of thing and all the issues of the Odyssey and the fear of other and fear of foreigners and all of that comes in. That's yeah, fascinating. Um, so I mean, I want to hear more about this in general, but also just the giants alone. So the giants are fascinating to me, and they're so hard to find sourcing on.
Hmm.
Like I tried to cover the Gigantomachy, and like all we really have that survives is like Apollodorus, and pseudo Apollodorus, and he's just so brief.
Yeah,
Like there's just nothing in there. So I'm so curious, I mean, about the giants in general.
yeah, yeah. You're right. Because having right dissertation on this, like
Yeah.
it's hard to find, and I was sort of drawn to them because they come up a lot in Latin poetry, and like I
Yeah.
definitely kind of have a whole theory about that. But you're right, like they're mentioned in Hesiod, but there is like we get the Titanomachy, we get the Typhonomachy, but there's no Gigantomachy. But we get a lot in art, like a lot of archaic art does have the Gigantomachy. I'm fascinated
Mhm.
by the way giants look in Greek and Roman art generally. Like in early Greek art, they're either heroic nudes or they're hoplites, like sort of the heavily armed soldiers that kind of became emblematic of the polis in the archaic
Mhm.
period and classical periods. where in some ways it makes them all look the same, where all the Olympians are sort of distinct. They have their own like sort of separate like distinct characteristics. Where the giants are kind of these monstrous figures. They're still kind of human in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a shift in like the fourth and third century where they get snake legs.
I mean, love that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, who doesn't? Again, speaking of snakes
Yeah.
and the complicated, significance that snakes can have in the Greco-Roman world. So there's an interesting shift in the giants' appearance. But like, yeah, we get snippets. Like, obviously, Apollodorus is like a full version of it, but like, you get references to it in Greek tragedy and things like that. But yeah, it's not until Apollodorus, and then like in Latin poetry, it's kind of you don't really get the whole. I mean, get the story in very brief moments, but like we have this sort of
Mm-hmm.
gigantomachic imagery.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm sort of fascinated by is like kind of in the archaic Greek period and afterwards, it kind of has the significance of like this is what scholars often say, but I think they kind of overstate it. Is that like the gigantomachy is basically order versus chaos, like the
Mm-hmm.
Olympians bringing order to chaos, and then like sort of transferably, like this is like Greeks bringing order, or over pushing order upon barbarians, and like
Mm-hmm.
the giants are the Persians, or the giants later are the Celts who were invading Europe in the fourth, third, second centuries BCE. And there is some evidence to suggest that in some of the texts here and there, but there are sometimes, like say, in Euripides' Ion. If you remember, like the Athenian chorus goes to the Temple of Delphi and they see the giants on the temple there. And what does that mean there? Like when they're looking at the giants, and they actually can mean civil strife sometimes, so an internal conflict as opposed to an external one.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about like sort of like monsters reflecting sort of cultural anxiety. You kind of easily see them representing like a fear of civil conflict, and then it kind of makes sense why the Romans would be into them, because in the first century BCE it's just like civil war after civil war after civil war.
Yeah, the Romans did have a lot of that going on.
They did. It's funny how people like try to make them sort of like the Romans, the symbols of the bringer of order. It's like, you guys were always fighting each other.
I mean, yeah, if it wasn't civil wars, it was the Punic Wars, and like they weren't fighting each other there, but they don't look good, you
No,
know. Like Rome, I don't know. Yeah, Rome. I'm not in Rome a lot, in my studying, I guess, for this podcast. But every
yeah,
time I come up with something or find something, it's constantly just it's the differences between the way the Romans, told stories and things versus the Greeks is really fascinating to me. I was looking at today. I was just editing an episode about witches
mm,
in classical myth generally, and Roman, and I talked to Maxwell Paul,
mm. I know,
if
Max.
you
Yeah,
know him on Twitter.
mhm.
So much Twitter. But there was a lot of Roman there because he studies one of them. And it's just so interesting because the Roman witches versus Greek witches are very, like, to me at least, they are like the way the Romans worried about their wives and like what their wives could do to them
Yeah.
versus Greek witches, which actually feel supernatural and like in a much more organic kind of way, I guess,
Hmm.
Cersei versus like some woman who's gonna, ensnare you in an inn. Like it just feels very different.
Yeah.
Um, the Giants too have always interested me because I love, how I think for the most part it all is supposed to have taken place like in Italy, right, or in Sicily even specifically.
Actually, the location of the Gigantic, it, like, as myths change, like sometimes it's in Greece, sometimes it's Italy. But I think like the Roman poets are taking
Mm.
advantage of, like, oh my God, our peninsula is sort of war torn, especially in Sicily. Sometimes there's
Yeah,
parts in Sicily too, and certain parts of the Civil War in the 30s BCE was taking place around there. So I think they're kind of very
right.
intentional of like, oh, we're going to take advantage of the fact that takes place here, because it's representing our civil conflict.
That makes sense. See, and I like it as a way to understand volcanoes.
Mhm. I mean, that's the other thing too. Also, it is like monsters
Yeah.
can be fear of natural disasters.
Yeah, that's what I always love. Is just the idea that like that wherever they buried them just happened to be, oh well, that volcano is just that happens to be where Zeus buried the
Yeah,
giant, and it's just a little angry right now.
and there's
That's one of my
overlap with them as civil strife too, because like there's the tradition that Mount Etna was spurting lava or smoke or whatever when Julius Caesar, or right before Julius Caesar was assassinated, which would bring about a whole series of civil conflicts. Like
Oh.
the idea is like Typhon, like sometimes it's Typhon under there, sometimes
Yeah,
it's
and then sometimes it's
Briareus.
giants. Yeah.
or it's Enceladus. I think it's like there's 3 different people, or 3
I
different
think
monsters.
isn't Briareus? I guess yeah, that makes sense.
Well, that's what I was
I
also
always think
fascinated because Briareus is on the side of the Titans in Hesiod. I'm sorry. Uh, he's on the side of the
yeah.
Olympians, and he said, "But you think
Yeah.
he'd be on the side of the Titans, given his birth and given
No,
his
but
monstrosity."
because the Hecatonchires, which is my favorite word, don't even know if I
Oh,
say it right,
that's
but
great.
it's the all-time best word in Greek myth.
Yeah,
But the reason from what I see of how they side with Zeus is because they kept getting imprisoned by everybody else,
yeah,
right? Because, Uranus imprisoned them, and then as soon as Kronos, did away with him, he freed them and then imprisoned them again because he was also an asshole. And then so the idea is that, like, I think Zeus freed them, and then he freed them and then gave them the privilege of guarding the underworld.
yeah.
And so therefore, or Tartarus rather, and so they were still tucked away and nobody could see them, but somehow they were freer than they were under
Yeah, so
Kronos.
he freed them, and it seemed like he gave them a sense of privilege, but it really was a way of like keeping them far away, right?
Yeah, it's like, you're not imprisoned in Tartarus, you get to guard Tartarus. Isn't that nice? I'm so much nicer of a ruler.
And then, like, what I think is interesting too is like because I'm also interested in Thetis. I'm co-editing a volume on Thetis, and that she
Ooh.
has the power to summon Briareus slash Aegeon,
Yeah.
and she
When
uses
they
it when like Zeus's kids are rebelling against him. So again, you have this sort of civil strife thing, but he kind of becomes a sort of watchdog for Zeus. But then Thetis is the
Mhm.
one who can summon him, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I'd
I
never
think.
thought of that connection. I tried to cover that coup. Of course, there's so little sourcing on
Right.
it too, but it was interesting to cover, and just the idea that, yeah, that like that's sort of what gained her favor for
Yeah.
her to use that favor in the Iliad. And oh my god, it's all just so, the interconnection between some of these stories, even though that they were so disparate in terms of like when they were written and developed and all of these things, it's just so extra interesting. Briareus appears in my new cocktail book that's coming out in
Oh, I think I saw a tweet
February.
about that. So I'm excited
Yeah.
as a monsters person. I'm interested in him in particular too. So maybe that'll become my new cocktail. We'll see.
It's got IPA in it, actually.
Oh, really?
Now that I
I like
realize you said that.
IPAs.
There you go. So you might like Briareus's brew. That's what it's
Ooh,
called.
cool.
I just had to had to find a reason to repeatedly use the word Hecatonchire in a book about cocktails.
No, that's awesome. But yeah, I think he's interesting because like there's definitely a version where he's in Etna. The whole who's under Etna seems to have been
Mm.
like a debate, and like it's sometimes
Mhm.
it's Typhon, sometimes it's Enceladus, and then I think it's Telemachus. See, like Clemens or
Oh,
Lycabron
okay.
that says so. Again, it's more obscure to have him under there. That's the more obscure version.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think he's on the side of the Olympians, and as you said, it makes sense because like Zeus like kind of frees him or whatever. But there is
Freeze,
a
yeah.
version where he's on the side of the Titans, and like
Mm.
Virgil kind of plays with all these expectations in it because there's a passage in the Aeneid where Aeneas is compared to Briareus slash Aegeon, and it's
Mm.
interesting because you think like, oh, he's gonna be like Briareus Aegeon because Briareus Aegeon's on the side of the Olympians who are the good guys. Aeneas is the good guy, so like therefore he's going to be associated with the Olympian order. But as you're reading the simile, it's like, yeah, then you have Aegeon, going against the lightning of Zeus. So he actually goes with the more like hipster, not that well known version, where Aegeon is on the side of the Titans. And I think like Virgil's really kind of playing with that, and like I think he's trying to make Aeneas out to be not that great of a guy. Because this is when Aeneas goes on his rage killing spree.
Mm. Of
And I think
course.
because like because the Titanomic and the Gigantomic get inflated with time, or like they kind of like becomes like kind of just throw all the monsters in there. Sometimes actually the
Makes sense.
Gorgon is in the Gigantomic. They'll throw in the Gorgon in there
Ooh.
for funsies. You know, and I think because like there are all these different versions of it, it kind of really fits into like a civil conflict where sometimes in a civil conflict it's hard to tell who's on whose side
Yeah, that's
in
true.
in a Roman civil war, especially when you have people changing sides all the time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I also do love the idea of sometimes, and I think it's a lot in Roman, unless I'm just making that up. I know it's also in Homer though, where there it's just sort of the idea of the Gorgon,
Hmm.
like you were saying, versus naming them or making them three or making Medusa one of them. It's just this idea of like a Gorgon. It's always interesting to me in the way that varies.
Yeah, yeah. I'm kind of struck by that too, because I'm thinking of the Euripides is the version. Euripides Ion is the version that I'm thinking of,
Mm.
where the Gigantomachy is brought up, and it just says the Gorgon. And some people think Euripides made that up because he does that sometimes, but it kind of fits the plot device because in the Ion, like they use the blood of the Gorgon. Creosa is going to use the blood of Gorgon to kill her son, and it kind of because I sort of also read the Gigantomachy as a family conflict. It's very easy to sort of see, oh yeah, they're monsters or whatever. These are children of Gaia, and Gaia is the grandmother of Zeus, so it's still like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is like kind of morally complicated in some ways. And I think in the Ion you have like a mother about to kill a son and a son about to kill a mother, and I think it's like kind of deliberately evoking the Gigantomachy because of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I forgot about that line. So I don't think I've actually fully read the Ion, but I know I've read that passage, and it might just have been like I have this Medusa source book because I'm so obsessed with her, and so I think I must have read that in there because now I'm like, where did that come from? Sometimes I
Yeah.
just know I've read things and I'm like, when, where, literally no idea. But I know
Definitely check out the
Homer.
whole play at some point. It's a really great
I
play.
will, yeah. I mean, I love Euripides so much, but
He's the
I love
best.
Euripides to the point where I'm currently trying to expand and
No,
like
I hear that.
reference other ones.
No,
But
yeah,
but ultimately, yeah, no, I'm going to cover them all. I mean, and of course, we're lucky enough to have more of Euripides than anyone else, so eventually I'll have that as a good
yeah. But
justification.
he is the best. I mean, it's just I know
Thank you. I
some of my
agree.
friend
Yep.
colleagues will come at me for this, but no.
Mhm. No, I agree with you completely. I definitely have had people on to defend the others. So far, no Aeschylus,
Mm,
um, but yeah, no, I mean, Euripides the best. It's just so good. His stuff's so weird and great and
yeah,
dark and bloody and awesome.
he's always subverting expectations, and
Yeah,
I think he's
he.
really calling into question a lot of social institutions more so I think than Aeschylus and Sophocles is. So I like him for
Hmm.
that.
Yeah, I think he's much more like intentionally rebellious, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Even just in terms of the way he treats women and like, for the
Hmm.
most part, makes them actual people. I mean,
Yeah.
like I would like I could talk about Medea forever,
All
specifically
right.
Euripides and
She's the
Medea.
best.
So yeah,
I'm a big med head. Yeah. She's awesome.
Man, I like that. I have to call myself that now.
TM. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But no, I mean Homer even only refers to one Gorgon.
Hmm.
So it's also this idea that it's like a very both an ancient idea and not and Medusa is equally ancient because Hesiod names Medusa and he names three Gorgons and yeah, the variations on who and what is a Gorgon is fascinating to me
Yeah.
because yeah, I mean even Hesiod doesn't really explain what that is, just says they're Gorgon and like granted they're the children of
Yeah.
sea monsters, but then they're not sea deities and
Yeah. And Medusa's the only
anyway.
mortal one.
Exactly, which like why?
Yeah.
And to me that makes me think like, well, I think there's no reason to suggest that her being the only mortal one could also make her different in other ways. And often the Gorgons are described in this like monstrous immortal kind of way, which suggests that Medusa then could be slightly less monstrous by being the only mortal one because often in I don't know if it's I feel like it's mostly archaic the art where because it's very old where she's depicted as just like a person with wings but
Mm.
ultimately otherwise looks exactly like a person. Usually it's like she's sleeping and Perseus is
Yeah. I'm
there
thinking
to
of the
cut her
Attic
head off.
pottery. She's more
Exactly,
human. Yeah.
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 And then there's even the Boeotian one where the Gorgons, I think they're fairly, I mean, quote unquote monstrous there. Like they have the very snake
The
hair.
tusks. Yeah.
Well, and there's one where I don't think they're very tusked. There,
Mm.
it's I know it's Boeotian, but it's I somewhere in the archaic period, but it's like very black piece, and there's literally one of the Gorgons is standing in front against Perseus, and Medusa's lying behind her with her head removed,
Mm.
and they have like the snaky hair and stuff, but at the same time, it's very like it's a very powerful scene of this is a sister protecting the sister you've just killed, and it's really
Mm.
interesting because it's very like I see it as very anti-Perseus in a way that,
Mm.
obviously the stories tend not to be, but the pottery often is very sympathetic to Medusa, which is
Yeah.
just
Yeah. I've
interesting.
noticed that too. But this particular one, like, I'd like to take a closer look at because, yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's really interesting because, like, and this goes with like monsters generally too, and it kind of is part of like some of my own like research into it. I think it's interesting how they kind of like can be this way to like other some marginalized group. But then they kind
Mm-hmm.
of can be empowering in some contexts, like with Medusa, like the head of the Gorgon was like an apotropaic device, right? To sort of
Mm-hmm.
keep bad things away. And in some ways, it's just the patriarchy sort of co-opting the feminine for its own purposes, and there's part of that too. But like, I think there is this sort of like sympathy for Medusa, and then later, Medusa as figure of empowerment that really develops. And it happens with a lot of monsters too. I'm kind of fascinated, like, yeah, like why do we want to reclaim monsters? Or it's funny how they in some
Mm-hmm.
ways they're like used to vilify a group, and that group takes it and makes it no, this actually she's our defender or they're our defender, which I think is really
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
I mean, I love Medusa, but have you speaking of Tumblr as we were earlier, have you seen the thing that goes around about the apotropaic nature of her, but that suggests, I forget what it is, but it makes it this idea that she was like very much a protector of women and
Hmm.
not just like a protective symbol,
Mm.
but it's very Tumblr history
I,
where
I
let's
haven't seen
not
that, but
do
I'm
that.
I'm, I'm very interested in it now. Though. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I want to think that I do think a lot of like the later reception or the making of these monsters more sympathetic, or the making of these monsters sort of these powerful figures. Like there's like often some sort of base in it in ancient texts. You kind of sort of start to see the seeds of it, and then you have like later groups kind of picking up on that. So I'm wondering if this face here, if it's seeing as like maybe there's something going on there. But yeah, it's so easy to just
Yeah.
shit on Perseus, right? He's
Well,
isn't
I mean,
you think Theseus is the worst? Isn't that your thing? Which I think you convinced me.
Theseus, I believe, is the worst. Jason is a close second. Perseus, I find it's just that he just like did whatever anybody told him to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, just killing
Um.
her in her sleeper. That's just so like how did
Well,
ancient like
exactly.
audiences even like take that? Like,
That's the thing, right? Like nothing about it. She also didn't attack him first. There's no reference to her actually like harming anyone with her
mhm,
head on her body. It's
mhm.
always just him using her head afterwards, which I find so interesting. Just jumping in from the future to say that we're about to discuss the piece of pottery that I brought up earlier, and I've linked to it in the episode's description if you're curious. Okay, back in.
It really does. Yeah, it seems like she's like standing up to Poseidon there. It's a real sort of power
Yeah, oh, I
stance
guess it is
there.
Poseidon too. Yeah, so that's
I mean,
interesting because Medusa's head is off her body and Pegasus is being born, but then it's also, yeah.
but you're right. Like, where is Perseus? Is that a different form of Perseus, or I'm thinking to do
Maybe
the
it's
same
just
connection
he's,
to Poseidon. I don't know.
yeah. Well, Poseidon is the father of Pegasus, so it's almost like
Mm.
this almost even more defends my point because I like to really argue that um it is that the idea of her being assaulted by Poseidon to be impregnated by Perseus and Chrysaor is from Hesiod,
Hmm.
not necessarily because Ovid makes it very explicit, but
Right.
I think Hesiod's making the same point. It's just that Hesiod would never say it was non-consensual because Hesiod did not consider whether things were consensual or
Right.
not.
Like
It was like not a concern.
euphemizing is. I mean, Ovid is a little bit, but Ovid I think is usually pretty good about being explicit.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah,
and
the
certainly in the
euphemizing of
Medusa, it's
sexual
explicit.
violence is so common, especially in a archaic and even the classical period.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I mean, the translation, I don't know ancient Greek, but I've asked a lot of people and read a lot of translations, and it's always translated as that Poseidon lay with
Yeah.
Medusa. And I think there's no reason not to describe that as potentially non-consensual, but
Yeah,
people on the internet love to hate me for it.
I'd have to look at the Greek, but even still, like, it does say just
Mm-hmm.
lay with, like it's because of the power dynamics of it all, and just like
Mm-hmm.
how Poseidon works, and some of
Exactly.
how Zeus works. It's like
Yeah.
it's almost never consensual.
Yeah. Well, and I argue too with Poseidon specifically, like Poseidon, as much as Zeus, it's was rarely consensual. Poseidon was much more violent. Like the stories we do have of Poseidon assaulting women are much more violent than the Zeus ones. Like with Zeus, they tend to write them as if like she wasn't into it, but like, it's fine because it's Zeus. Whereas Poseidon, it's like, it's often pretty explicit that he was
Yeah.
violent and dangerous. So to me, it's just like, well, what is the likelihood of the Medusa just happened to be one where she was into it? I
Right.
don't know.
No,
It's
I
yeah.
I totally see that, and like think of Poseidon too.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of like in this inferior position to Zeus, so he kind of has like that chip on his shoulder
Mm-hmm.
about it, and like especially like him taking that out in in awful ways. And this is especially with the sea and just violence. I think there's like
Yeah.
definitely something going on with that. So I'm
Yeah. Well,
um
even like he got his wife by forcing her to marry him. Like
yeah,
everything about him is super gross.
right, right, yeah.
Yeah. Um okay, I'm trying to get us onto the monsters more. I don't know. I mean, clearly Medusa is a monster, but I just always think I talk about Medusa too
No, I'm
much.
happy to keep talking about it because I had a whole like class just on Medusa. So
Oh, good.
I mean,
That's great. What do you cover and stuff like that?
so yeah, because I feel like also it's kind of hard to get like the because it kind of gets all you get all piecemeal and you get like Ovid's version, which is kind of one of the more interesting ones.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I usually have they'll read like the Apollodorus version of it, and then I probably give that brief bit from Hesiod. Um, but then I like to sort of pair that with just more modern receptions of Medusa, and I kind of talk about how it's like she's used. It's interesting how she becomes this figure of empowerment in some context, but she's still used for misogynistic purposes today. Like if you just Google, like I'm gonna say Google female politician and Medusa, and
Oh
see what
God.
comes up, and you'll like
Mm.
probably like 7 out of 10 times you'll find something.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. For me, I come across it so much on Twitter because I mean, very often I have got into like Twitter beefs with people, I guess, for lack of a better term, of just by suggesting that Medusa. I mean, various things. Like, I actually at this point really enjoy taunting it because I have all of the information to back it up, and I find it interesting to
Hmm.
see where people jump to. Because sometimes, like, if I say like, Medusa was defending herself, or Medusa didn't hurt anyone, or things like that are. I mean, the defending herself is like, not necessarily true based on the original text, or not original, but
Hmm.
like, all the sources we have. Um, but the idea that she didn't hurt anyone is pretty explicit in almost every source.
Hmm.
There's like, while her head was on her body, there's no evidence that she really hurt anyone.
Yeah.
Um, and then, but the way people will leap to, oh, you're talking about Ovid's version, and that doesn't count because he was a Roman. Or the opposite, where it's like, no, but Ovid said this, so what are you talking about with who's this guy Hesiod? And the way people like need to tell a woman that she is wrong about Medusa, and by people, I should say, like these are always men. The way
They're
men
always
feel the need to
they're always
tell a
men.
woman, they're always men, or women who are clearly like really defined by the patriarchy,
Yes.
and
Hmm.
like yeah, they're still like they react in the same way as men. Like they clearly have that issue. But yeah, it's always like you can't be right about Medusa. Here's why, and that why varies greatly. So very often it's like the idea that Ovid doesn't count, like the idea that he's just a completely separate being. It's unrelated to Greek myth is so fascinating to me. Like it just portrays an obvious misunderstanding of the way these things worked.
Yeah.
Like it's as if there, for all we know, Ovid could have been working off of a Greek source we don't
We don't
have.
know for sure.
He may not have invented the idea of her being a priestess of Athena. He may not have invented it being explicitly assault. Like still I say I would argue that Hesiod makes it pretty clear without using any explicit terms.
Hmm.
But then when I say that, they're like, just because he says he doesn't say it was assault doesn't mean it was assault. And I'm like, yeah, but it's Hesiod. Like, and it's
Yeah.
Poseidon. There are so
There-
many reasons why
There's a
you
whole
can make that
pattern of
leap.
euphemizing sexual violence where you can, if you look at the whole
Hmm.
pattern, like this fits into that pattern. You
Yeah,
know.
exactly. Between that and the fact that it is Poseidon, and you're not talking about a source that is likely to be explicit about a woman's, desires or otherwise. Like, it's fascinating to me to watch the way people react to her in a way that they don't react to most other Greek myth generally. There's something about Medusa that just like creates this mess.
Yeah, because I feel like she like I think it's because like she can still be used for misogyny, in its most extreme form today, but also she is she can be this empowering figure. People have adopted her on Tumblr and in modern feminist adaptations, and
Mm-hmm.
um I feel like because of that extreme, people want to take one side of it, or they're sort of so attached to one side of it they can't really see anything else. But the whole idea of like Ovid
Mm-hmm.
isn't really like his myth isn't the real myth. It's like that's such like classicizing like bullshit of like but like the Greeks were making the real myth. But like no, like myths just change. Um,
Yeah. Like, and there's so many years in between. It's not like,
yeah,
I mean, yeah, there's so many
and
years in between so many of these sources that people want to claim like one over the other. And you're just
yeah,
like, no, things shift and adapt. And,
and the same thing with monsters too. Like they're always reflecting. I mean, with Medusa, it's often some sort of misogyny, but it's like different variations of it in each
mm-hmm.
adaptation. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and yeah, and there, I got one person once whose whole defense was that Medusa deserved to die
Oh my
because
god.
yes, because, and this is basically a quote, like I'm paraphrasing, but this is exactly the same point he was making, was that she was terrorizing the lands, which is like not found in a single anything source. Nothing. It's literally not based in mythology.
To me, it sounds like they took another monster who like was
Mhm.
terrorizing. I feel like always like these boars. For some reason, yeah, boars are monsters in Greek mythology sometimes, and
Yeah.
they're always terrorizing the land. Because I see how they usually transferred to like another monster. Like yeah, they're all the same, right? Boar,
Yeah,
snake
woman
haired
with snake's
lady.
hair.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, but like as if, that she really needed to die. The way that she is used in this way, or yeah, she deserved to die. I've heard her death alleviated like a pressure on the world. That I've heard from somebody where I'm like, you're putting an awful lot into Greek myths that
yeah.
is not there.
They also
Like,
sound like they're kind of taking something else, and just like there's this image of like you have these heroes who come and they like there's all these monsters that need to get rid of, and they kind of come through and like make the world a better place
yeah.
by taking them out. And it's like compare it with like St. Patrick and the snakes and stuff like that too. Like they're
Mm.
civilizing the world. Greece used to be a scary place with giant lions and boars, and then Heracles came along and made everything
Hmm.
better.
That's the thing, yeah. It like wants to connect to that Heracles level hero. That yeah, he killed the Nemean lion, he killed the Hydra, but Perseus and Medusa isn't that. It
No,
isn't in any sourcing. It's literally a king wanted her head because he expected it to kill Perseus, not because he actually wanted her head.
yeah.
And that alone is so interesting to me because there's no claim. Like I recently covered Perseus in more detail than I had before, and yeah, there's nowhere that claims that Medusa had done anything. It
Yeah.
was just that he assumed that the process would kill
It was literally a way,
Perseus.
like it was his like dynastic anxiety of just like, oh shoot,
Yeah.
like gotta get rid of this kid here,
Like I might as well go ask him for the craziest wedding gift I can, or yeah, is it
Yeah,
wedding gift, whatever it is, yeah, thing I can think of,
yeah,
Yeah, just so interesting, all of that. I really appreciate, or not appreciate, but I really find it interesting in a dark kind of way, the way people project their own shit
yeah.
onto Medusa.
And that's interesting. If you think about myth generally, because again, like I was talking about monsters, monster theory, and how there's some sort of like reflection of something about a culture. Um, but I feel like monsters are kind of like a microcosm of that. Of like we kind of put our fears and anxieties onto these monsters, and I think it sounds like that's what's happening with these people. They're kind of putting onto this monster, something that they're something that they're worried about, or something that is reflecting something that the culture that they're coming from. Because I mean, kind of I
Mhm.
think it's what like when you have one author who takes an earlier monster, they're gonna like take some of the essence of the original monster, but they're gonna put their own spin on it when they refashion it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like they're putting, they're seeing women take hold of Medusa as a symbol of
Yes,
feminism and strength. And they're like, this is bad. And thus I will invent all of these reasons,
right.
but claim they're from ancient Greece, that obviously Medusa was truly monstrous and horrible and she deserved to die. And there was this whole thing. And that's why women are wrong for taking hold of Medusa.
Yeah,
Like,
it is sort
that's
of
all
like
there is
that
to it.
patriarchal fear of something being taken from them. Like, no, Medusa's supposed to
Yeah.
work for us, not
Yeah,
for you.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
wild. It's just truly it hasn't happened on Twitter in a while, and I don't miss it, but I kind of do because it's just been a really dark insight into the
yeah,
way some people think.
yeah. One of the things that I also asked them about Medusa too, because most of these students who come in loving myth, they know Percy Jackson, and I asked them to
Right.
remember, well, how is Medusa represented in the first Percy Jackson book? And actually, none of them seem to remember. And when I tell them, like, oh yeah, she's
Okay.
a Middle Eastern woman who's wearing like a burqa or hijab. I can't remember, but like I'm thinking like, oh my god, like this is. I mean, have
Holy
you
shit.
have you like went back and read the first Percy Jackson in a
No, so
while?
I was too old for them when they
Yeah,
came
same.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speak. Our friend Max Polly, he
Yeah.
wrote a great article in Eidolon called "The Whitening Thief" that talks about all this sort of like Western civilization language in it. I mean, it's throughout the entire
Ooh.
novel. It's one part where like the one character's like, yeah, and like now Mount Olympus is in New York because the United States is the head of Western civilization and everything. And so there's that. But then like
Holy
yeah,
shit.
I think it says something when you have Medusa as Middle Eastern woman. It says something about like a culture reflecting a cultural anxiety. If you know what I mean.
Oh
Um,
my god, what my listeners can't see is my face right now. I feel like I'm not expressing it enough in words and it's just visual, but like holy shit. No, I had no idea. I
yeah,
honestly know nothing about Percy Jackson except that
yeah.
back when the first movie came out, I saw it. But that was
hmm
also a long time ago and all I remember is that it's Uma
In the
Thurman.
movie, they rightfully so.
Yeah.
And as much as the fans hate that movie, uh, they that was as a good
That was
choice.
yeah, holy shit.
Yeah. On the one hand, I feel like by making it like a traditionally attractive white woman like Uma Thurman, there's something not great about that, but it's better
Yeah.
than making her a Middle Eastern woman. Yeah.
Well, and then now I think about why I was too old for it. Like I think it came out in like 2005 or 6, the first
Yeah.
one. And which
Yeah.
means, there was a certain something going on in a
Right.
certain Middle Eastern place that makes that even less cool, if it can be even less
Yeah.
cool. But it's
Yeah.
kind of all from that same time period of like 300
Oh yeah.
and
Exactly.
Troy
hmm
and
And look at
oof.
speaking of monstrification, generally not necessarily classical monsters, but in that movie, like if you read the graphic novel, which like isn't great either, like
No, it's very
at
similar.
the end, like he recommends like a Victor Davis Hanson book, which is like, oh no, I wouldn't recommend that.
Oh.
But like you do kind of have like there's all this Orientalism with the representation of the Persians, and Xerxes is so othered, and kind of like there's I get sort of like an othering with the way his gender presentation is represented.
Mhm.
Um, but there are no monsters in the graphic novel. That they were all
Mm.
added for the movie.
Hmm.
So like there's definitely like they took the graphic novel, which wasn't great, and kind of intensified the racism uh,
Yeah.
in it.
That's
Which is again,
interesting. I've only flipped through the graphic novel,
yeah.
but now I just remember looking at it and thinking, "Oh, this is not much better."
And actually, the graphic novel is better with skin tones. It represents Greeks having darker skin tones, where in the
Oh, that's
movie they're
good.
all so white. you
Oh my
know,
gosh. It's like,
um,
I mean, in Troy and stuff too, where you're like, why are you all white and like British or American?
yeah,
It's all just very weird.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think you're right to sort of make that connection with. Yeah, it's all around that same time period.
Hmm.
That being said, though, again, like I haven't read all of Rick Riordan's book, but it seems like he like unlike a certain person we mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
seems like he's taken the criticism well and has changed with time. So it
Yeah.
sounds like his later novels are much better about like inclusivity and things like that and representation.
That's good.
So it seems like
Yeah.
with time he's like kind of figured it out, and he's like, yeah, it does what a certain person who must not be named doesn't do. He like hears the criticism, like, okay, yes, that was bad, and I will try to be better about this.
Yeah. And it certainly was like, there's a flawed argument, but there's an argument to be made for like it was of its time. Doesn't make it
Right.
right. But it's like if that was written today, I don't think a person deserves a second chance to redo it. But yeah,
hmm
I mean it, something that's that old and then, it's all about I think recognizing mistakes and things like that. But
Yeah.
I just cannot. I'm sorry, I just can't get over
I remember
that.
reading it. I'm like,
People
oh my god, like
yeah.
this was like
Oh my
longer ago,
god.
but not that. I think I read it in like 2015. I was just like, oof.
Yeah.
This is hard
Yeah.
to read now.
I mean, yeah, that shouldn't have come out in 2005 or 6 either. Like,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
But that's wild. No, people ask me about Percy Jackson all the
right,
time because a lot of my listeners are younger than me, which is like, I get it. I'm glad that it brought so many people into this world, and then they continued to learn, and they found my podcast or whatever, and then I can teach them even more. But it's funny to me because there's a lot of like, I don't know if I can go back, and if I want to bother going back and reading a book that was like, it's about an 11-year-old that came out when I was like 16 or 17, that now I'm in my 30s, and I'm like, I just don't think it's worth it, guys. Like, because people want me to read it and talk about it, and I'm like,
yeah,
I'm not going to ever have the same connection to it that people did when they read it when they were young. Like,
yeah.
there's not going to be any of that for me. And then now hearing that Medusa bit, I'm like, I just don't think that people want to hear what I have to say about those original ones. I don't think that they want to hear it. They think they want to hear it, and they'd be wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Apparently, though, Disney Plus is making a series with Rick
Mhm.
Riordan. Uh, and I think a
Mhm.
lot of people were upset because like the movie wasn't as good because they didn't work with Rick Riordan, and also
Yeah,
because
he
it sounds like Rick Riordan is like getting better about like trying to make sure his his works are accessible to everyone and not traumatizing or alienating anyone. Maybe there's a chance
yeah.
it could be good and watchable. So
Well, and I know he publicly hates those movies. Like, he
yeah,
talks about how bad they are compared to his books.
yeah,
So, yeah, oh, that's really fascinating, that because Medusa, to me, like in pop culture, I always more think of, Clash of the Titans, I think, has become kind of people's opinion on her. Like,
hmm
people really take what she is in that original one and kind of make that into, that is what Medusa looked like in the mythology, which is fascinating.
that movie, the 1981 version, really kind of has had captured the popular imagination.
Yeah, it's made her this like snake body, I think is the point of it, right? Like, the bottom half snake
Right.
is very much 100% like invented by Clash of the Titans, almost calling upon Echidna, who's kind of described like
hmm
that in some of the
Yeah, it becomes sort
sources.
of just like a monster kind of a monster of a monster. We kind of take two of the monsters and putting them together to make her more
Yeah.
monstrous. And like, yeah, she is so
Yeah.
monstrous in Clash, but then in the remake, she's still like she's got the snaky tail, but she's a more traditionally attractive woman. And there's probably
Yeah.
stuff we could unpack with that.
Well, she's also, I mean, yeah, I mean, this was going to be fully a technological complaint about that. But she's just so CGI'd in a bad way in the
Right.
newer one. It's so weird.
Yeah.
But
I think it's even like more misogyny in the remake. 'Cause someone's written an article like where they kind of pick apart a lot of the ways she's represented, and there's like that whole line or like tell them men did this. And obviously on the
mm,
surface it kind of means like humankind, but it could be sort of like men, like sort of like the you know men in the gender sense, which is like kind of
yeah.
ick.
That's
Um,
interesting. I haven't seen that in a while.
the CGI one is, or
Mm.
I call it the CGI one.
Yeah.
The remake is it's so CGI. We see the human in the monsters, and that's why people reclaim them because, like, often people who are said to be monsters aren't really monsters. They're monstrified for some sort of nefarious reason.
Mhm.
One of the theses is that the monster is also a kind of desire, or sort of like we kind of project our fantasies onto the monster. And I think it's why, like, as much as like say you can have a monster that is meant to sort of marginalize women, but later because Medusa is like a powerful female figure, she can be readopted. And I talk about like there's just a larger pattern of that, even coming to the modern
Mhm.
era too. And sometimes like they like monsters get reclaimed by figures you wouldn't think. Like for example, like the Minotaur is like huge in queer communities. Like they love
Mm.
the Minotaur, and he kind of pops up as gay and or genderqueer and in different contexts. I'm kind of fascinated by that too, where like the Minotaur is this main creature, and like why do these monsters get? And I don't really have answers, but I'm just like I'm using this to explore things. Really, like I'm
Yeah.
saying, like why do we like kind of like want to take these monsters back? But I think it's something very powerful about that. This idea of you're taking a figure that was used to harm or oppress one group, and then they can take it and it can be you know the symbol of empowerment. So the base of it is that monster, and maybe this is obvious, but like monsters are a reflection of some sort of cultural anxiety,
Mhm.
and but at the same time they can be reclaimed, and I think it kind of like speaks to the you know the mutability of myth and how it I find it kind of hard sometimes to study what we study because like oh my god, like look at all this misogyny, like all of this like ethnocentrism, and look how it's used in colonialism, but it's kind of cool when they can be you know proclaims. That's why I find it particularly interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think ultimately I feel like just even you repeating that part of it is, I think we've just talked about all of that without even necessarily going into the more like the deeper academic logistics of it. So I think that's kind of great too, because you're right, like that's just sort of how the conversation about Medusa went, and even just the monsters. And I like the, now just to rehash what we talked about, but the giant stuff and the difference between the Greece and Rome versions of them,
Mm-hmm.
they're very interesting to me. So
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, are there any other monsters, like specific monsters, that you have a particular affection for that you want to talk about?
So yeah, I talked about the Minotaur, and I think like he like besides Medusa is like probably one of the more famous ones. I think it's interesting how like yeah the queer community has really kind of taken him up, and there's like think it kind of starts early. Like there we have pots of with baby Minotaur on them, so it's like Pasiphae
Oh, I
and like
know
little
that one's so cute.
and it's just so cute. Like oh my god, but he was like a baby once, and like I think there are like I'm thinking of Attila's 64 in particular, where like you have Ariadne sort of saying, "I killed my brother for you," like that wasn't easy. I think it's sort of just like yeah, he was somebody's brother, he was somebody's child, and
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, I don't know. This is more. I don't have an answer, but I think like
Yeah.
there's such a fascination with the Minotaur, even though he's such like a kind of like one of the most monstery of the monsters. Like he eats people. He's part human, part cow. But there's something
Mm-hmm.
about him that really sort of resonates. I don't know if it's the isolation, maybe sort of like with people with marginalized identities, they kind of like felt that isolation of being stuck, in the maze and be made out to be monsters by society. Um,
Mm-hmm. I think there's also that really, for lack of a better word, that really sexy statue of him and
mm,
Theseus.
mm,
And I swear, like, so much of any kind of like theory about him and gender and sexuality and stuff comes from that, because it
yeah.
is pretty explicit.
It's very sexualized, yeah. So that's actually definitely part of this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, that's interesting. No, well, I had Corbeth Fraser on too
mhm.
recently to talk about the Minotaur as it relates to like theories around autism, which was super interesting.
Oh, really? Okay. That's definitely there's a lot of connections there.
Yeah, and it's similar of that, the isolation, right? That the labyrinth and all of those things. But I think the Minotaur and Medusa are some of the most fascinating because you can apply so many different things to them, and even though they're supposed to be monstrous, it's so easy to connect with them on and their stories on like pretty human levels in different ways. Like
Yeah.
whether it's angry men on the internet yelling at you for no
Yeah.
reason, or
Mhm.
yeah, the isolation of a minotaur, or
Yeah.
so many things. It's just, yeah, they're all so fascinating.
Too
Hmm.
is like sometimes when I talk about these monsters, and I talk about monsters that aren't necessarily related to the classical world, and like how like you can kind of apply these theories to like Gritty. I'm sort of fascinated
Hmm.
by you familiar with Gritty, the mascot of
Yeah.
the Philadelphia Flyers, who went from like hated figure like what was this? This is the worst mascot in the world to like oh my god, he's this anti-fascist symbol. I think I see a similar pattern going on too. He's a monster, but he kind of becomes this like I think it's interesting how like monsters often associated with chaos, like Typhon, like the giants, and but he's still like this chaos figure, but he's like good chaos. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think it's really interesting, and like we kind of live in an absurd time. He's kind of just like this fitting monster to sort of reflect that, but he's like this sort of positive figure, which I think
Yeah,
is
that's
really
so
interesting.
true. He has a lot of Muppet characteristics too, which I think lend him to certain generations,
Hmm.
Like I think he just is kind of, he has that part what makes me think that he might as well be like either, amongst the Muppets, the traditional Muppets, or on Sesame Street, or, any of those things where I'm just like, he just kind of seems like a nice guy. But also, yeah, he has become an anti fascism figure in a really fascinating way.
But also, don't mess with him because he will mess you up. you know?
That's true. That's true. Yeah. He wouldn't get along on Sesame Street. He'd get kicked out. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. I hadn't thought about him.
So I applied it to him. Then also, I have you seen the movie Luca, the Pixar movie Luca?
No, I've heard of it.
Okay, it's pretty cool. I won't give any spoilers in it, but like the premise is that there's this young sea monster who lives. He's like a fish shepherd who's off the coast of Italy, but he wants to go. It's kind of like the premise of like Little Mermaid. Like he wants to go beyond his world and sort of see the upper world, but his parents won't let him. But eventually he does. But it actually has the same rules as the movie Splash. I don't know if you remember the movie Splash. Basically,
It's been a long
when you
time, but
get
yeah.
dry, you become a human. So that's basically how it works. So he's this monster, and also he's going to this town where they hate sea monsters, so he has to kind of be careful he doesn't get wet. When he meets this other boy, and it's interesting. I definitely like started watching. I'm like, oh, they're clearly like this is a romance between them. Like I read them as sort of there's a sort of a romantic thing going on between them, and nothing like explicit happens. But like after the end, I'm like, oh, clearly like that was like a romance, a queer romance. I'm like, wow, Disney,
Mm-hmm.
good for you. But then like the director came out and was like, no, or the writer came out like, that's not meant to be it. But like other people were definitely reading it that way, especially like with the connection of like queer people and monsters. I'm like, there's something going on with that. And so it's a very sort of lovely story, and I think it kind of
Mm-hmm.
leads into the whole like questioning like who is the monster, and because like so basically this pair they go to the city and they want to like buy a Vespa. It's very Italian stereotypes, but they want to buy a Vespa so they can see the world, and they realize, oh, there's this triathlon happening. It's like I think a bicycle race, like a swimming contest, and a pasta eating contest. Again, full of Italian stereotypes. Like, okay, if we win this contest, then then we can get the Vespa to see the world. But their competitor is this sort of like super kind of preppy bully like figure, and his name is Ercole. And then I'm like, Ercole, and I'm like, that's not. I'm looking up Italian word for Hercules. Oh my God, his name means Hercules. Uh,
Oh my
in
god.
in English, and like he's kind of this opposing figure to monsters, but he's the dick, right? He's the one like he even wears the sweater crossed over his, like not wearing the sweater, but like kind of wears it over his shoulders, like in a really preppy
Yep.
way, and he's kind of this bully figure, and I think it's kind of really subverting the whole Hercules as monster slayer thing. And then
That's really
it's a
interesting.
cool queer uh, story too. So yeah,
Yeah. I did not know any of that. I feel like I must have only heard the name of it
yeah.
because that sounds lovely and now I want to
Yeah,
watch it.
check it out. But that a lot of interesting like
Yeah.
sort of monster imagery and questioning the monster,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Yeah, that's really fascinating, especially the Hercules bit. Like,
yeah.
oh my god, that's
I'm like, whoa,
fascinating.
this seems like there's one statue in the town center where they go to, and there's this kind of really burly statue of a man. He's like holding a sea serpent, and it's like choking a sea serpent. And I'm like, it kind of reminded me of like just images of Hercules fighting the Ketos. Yeah,
Mhm.
so yeah,
Mhm.
so check it out.
I will. I always think of Hercules too when he's a baby and he kills the two snakes.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a baby, but
Oh
still
yeah, that's
obviously
actually I
killing
didn't thought
them.
of that. Actually, I think that's going on there too. Yeah, because it's very clear
Mhm.
like strangling from what I remember. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, he does do that, but as a baby.
he's a
Lots of
strangler. Hercules,
yeah.
Nemean lion. Yeah,
Yeah, he resorts to that a lot. I mean, fine, he had to in the Nemean Lion, I
yeah,
guess, but
yeah.
yeah. uh, well, I mean, honestly, I think this has been really fascinating.
This has been great. No, thank you so much.
Just love talking about monsters, and I got to talk about Hecaton Kyries,
No,
so
I'm a
that's
big fan.
another
We should
great
keep
story.
talking about because I think that's like a future project. I want to like dive deeply more into them, particularly
Oh my
Briareus
god.
Aegeon, because I just find like the fact he's on like two different sides of the conflict in different versions, and his
Mhm.
connection to Thetis I find really interesting.
Mhm.
Um,
I mean, yeah, the more you research him, please feel free to
yeah.
reach out and come back on and
Oh
talk
yeah.
about Hecaton Kyries because I mean, people know that about me too. It's just the amount that I will try to say that word as much as
Yeah.
humanly possible.
I think I made
Yeah,
a joke on
it's
Twitter a while ago that like the hundred handers sounds like a '90s band or something like that. Like I don't know, but the heck,
yeah,
yeah, I can't
that's
even
very
say the
true.
Greek. I know Greek, but I can't even say the name. The heck, yeah, but yeah,
And I don't
the,
know Greek, so I just whatever it's and then
the
I'm
heck of
assuming it's
hands.
mostly right. I haven't yeah, yeah, the 100 hands, that's fine. There's
Yeah.
even a reference to that in Odyssey. But
Oh, is there?
again, it's like, yes. Oh my gosh, you need to keep playing this
I gotta.
game. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I gotta play it more. Yeah, exactly. I just gotta keep.
Yeah, no, there's like a whole, but it's another one of those like this is a rationalization, this is like an understanding of it. There's like a competition, and it's called like the
Mm.
Battle of 100 Hands.
Oh, they love that rationalization. That's special with that game. They
Mm-hmm.
put that rationalization, but then they have the crazy monster stuff. Like,
I know.
yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much. Do you want to promote anything? Do you want to have people find you on Twitter or anything like that if you want to share?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, trying to think like when like I have like a book coming out on that. I'm co-editing a book on Thetis.
Oh, that's
Um,
great.
that's hopefully come out in the spring. That's when it should be coming out. Um, but yeah, you can share my Twitter handle.
Yeah, I'll put it in the episode. You have a Latin Twitter handle, don't you? Had a
I
couple
do.
people from
I don't know.
Latin.
I listen.
Yeah,
I
it's
heard
really hard.
your podcast with Avon, and yeah, like yeah.
Yes.
Latin poetry is awesome. Okay, I get that. It's
No,
not
it's
the
great.
pure,
It's
untouched myth, but like it's really cool what the Romans do with myth. Okay,
I know the Romans are great. I more even mean it from a basic level of people trying to then search for you on Twitter. Because Max, he had the same problem. He was like trying to say it, and I was like, people aren't going to find that, so I'm just going to put a link in, and people can follow you on Twitter and find out more about the giants or the Hecatonchires or Thetis, or we have a lake here that's called Thetis Lake,
I
but
think
it's spelled the
I think
same.
I found that when I was doing just like some deep dives. Because I mentioned like what does status mean? Because actually I'm writing one chapter in this volume, and my chapter is about Thetis in the 1981 Clash of the Titans. Because notice she's not in the remake. They cut her out.
Okay, so I have not seen the original.
You've not seen the original?
No, I need to. I don't know why I haven't yet.
The original's actually kind of good. It's campy, but it's like good campy, and like
Yeah.
it's much like you gotta see the original. Maggie Smith.
I know.
Dame Maggie Smith plays Thetis.
Oh, fuck off. Yeah, okay. You've just sold me. I've been meaning to forever, and I saw Jason on the Argonauts, and I really enjoyed that for the campiness.
I think this is better.
It was.
I think.
Okay,
anyway, yeah.
I'm gonna watch it, especially if it's Maggie Smith is plays that's amazing.
And she's like the villain, but I think she's a really cool villain.
Yeah,
and I have a whole theory that so Laura Slatkin wrote this book in the 90s that's basically about like Thetis kind of has this secret power, and you can kind of like catch glimpses of it in the Iliad and later adaptations. Because like notice how like she like Zeus has to kind of listen to her,
mm-hmm.
and like she can kind of influence Zeus. Like why can she influence Zeus? And then the whole thing of like, oh, like when they find out that her son's going to be greater than his father, we got to marry her after mortal. Like she gets her some sort of power from her, like from her womb, and that kind of gives her like even though she's sort of marginalized in many ways, she can kind of influence the other Olympians.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, because she's not like used very often.
No, and then like have you read Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller? Yeah. I kind of don't. I love that book, and I love all of Miller's work, but I kind of don't love how evil she made Thetis in that. Because I feel like in the Iliad, she's like kind of very sympathetic figure, and I get that she needed a villain, and like there is actually like from having edited this volume, like there is a tradition where Thetis isn't that great. I think she's like pretty good in the Iliad, but there's like tradition that she like killed a bunch of her kids trying to make them immortal. Yeah, the whole like trying to make Achilles immortal. Like there's the famous story of the dipping, but there's also a story that like basically she's like doing like a Medea type thing, where she's like putting kids into a pot to try with like magic to make them immortal. But the first like 6 died, and it's like serious mom shaming thing going on. Yeah. So there is like a basis for like evil Thetis, but it kind of comes later, which is interesting.
Yeah. Thank you again so much for doing this. It's been really fun. I fucking love monsters and giants and Hecatonchires and Medusa and any excuse to talk about them with somebody else who knows them that much. It's so good.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure, and it's great to talk with someone who loves monsters like Medusa as much as I do.
Right? Nerdy stuff. It's so good.
And video games. Yes.
Oh my god, exactly. All of it.
Everything I wanted and more. Yeah.
Ah, nerds. Thank you all, as always. This was an incredibly fun conversation to record. You always know they're fun when we go so far off the rails. Truly. So fun, and so fun to listen to again after so many months after when I edited it just now. I love this part of my job so very much. But I also have to say that I wrote the first half of this intro and edited the episode on Wednesday. Now, it's Thursday. And I'm recording this. It's Thursday, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. Normally, I would have some pithy ending to an episode, some fun thing to say, but I don't. I don't know how to handle what I'm watching unfold and what I'm reading. I didn't want to say anything at the top of the episode because this was recorded so long ago, and it's great, and my guest deserves better than to have it introduced with such horrifying news. But I also don't want to pretend it's not happening or that I'm not paying attention. To all my listeners in Ukraine, I'm sure you won't hear this right now, but when you do, know that I'm thinking of you and your entire country. Thank you all so much for listening. I am Liv, and I love this shit.